Hey, Luke here. Welcome back to the channel. Today, in episode 2 of the Ansible for SQL Server DBA series, I'll be talking about installing SQL Server using Ansible. We'll be building on what we did in episode 1, where we prepared our disks. Today, we'll actually be installing a default instance of SQL Server 2022 Developer Edition. So I'm going to jump right into it. I'm going to go off the screen first. And just real quick, wanted to provide an overview of the lab environment. Again, this is the same environment I used in episode 1, where I have a domain controller, SRv3, which is our Ansible controller. It's on Windows Server 2022. I am using the Windows subsystem for Linux and an Ubuntu distribution. SRv1 and 2 are both Windows Server 2022 evaluation machines. And as you can see here, we don't have the disk formatted or anything. I do have 3 additional disks, just like in episode 1. We'll be formatting and preparing those, but all as part of the same process to install SQL Server. And just so that you can see, we can see that we don't have SQL Server installed here already. Same on SRv2, no disks, and SQL Server 2022 is not installed. I'll put the links and everything for the GitHub repository down in the description, just like on episode 1. And also, I am thinking about putting together a course just to go in more detail over Ansible for SQL Server DBAs. I'll leave a link to that wait list down in the description as well. If this topic is of interest to you, just let me know by signing up for that wait list. So the first thing we'll take a look at is the new playbook that we've defined. This is a very simple installation. As we progress through this series, we'll go in more depth on a few of these things. But Playbook install SQL Server is the one we're working with today. If you've already downloaded or cloned this repository, you would have had diskprep.yml in the host ini and the README. I've added this playbook that we're looking at today and also the config 2022.j2 file, which is a Jinja 2 file, and we'll look at that as well. I'm going to go ahead and enable Cursor Pro so that you can see my cursor moving around. I have Visual Studio Code pulled up here, and let's just jump through or take a look at a few of these different tasks that we'll be doing today. The first thing that we're going to do in our playbook is initialize the disks. So to do that, we're going to be importing the playbook underscore diskprep.yml playbook. That's the one we worked on in episode 1. So instead of copying and pasting all of that code into this one, we'll just call Ansible's built-in import playbook, which allows us to essentially run that playbook before we do anything in this one. And the next step is we're going to actually install SQL Server. Again, we're using the same inventory file, which is host.ini, and then we're going to reference the SQL Servers group. If you need to see that again, here that is the SQL Servers, both SRv1 and 2, and then these are our variables defined for that group. So handlers don't get executed normally, only when notified after each section of a task is complete. So if something changes, then the handler will run. So in this case, I'm creating a handler to pause once we mount the ISO that we are using to install SQL Server. Then we're going to pause for 5 seconds just to make sure it does get mounted successfully. So we'll jump into the task that we're defining with this playbook. The first one is determine if the default instance already exists. So we want this playbook to be idempotent. So if we run it again, after we do the initial install, we don't want Ansible trying to reinstall a default instance if it already exists. So we're going to go ahead and use Ansible Windows Win Service to look for uh, the MS SQL Server service, and then we're going to register that here. So a register is basically a variable that will contain a task status and module return data. So if this is empty, uh, then we know that that service has not already been installed and we can continue through the playbook. So here is where we're going to use that variable. So the name of this task is in play if default instance already exists. We're going to use the built-in meta Ansible action. So meta tasks are special kind of tasks which can influence Ansible uh, internal execution or state. So we are actually going to end the play if when the service info does exist. So the rest of these tasks will not run if the service already exists. The next task is the Windows power plan. We're going to set the Windows power plan to high performance. So we don't want our CPUs running at half speed or the SQL server box going to sleep if no one's using it. So we're going to use the Windows.Win power plan module to set the power plan to high performance. Next, we're going to actually create a temp folder on the C drive of each of our targets, so on both SRV 1 and 2, and that's where we're going to copy our ISO to. So you can see here we're using the win file module. The path is ctemp. The state is a directory, and then this we can exclude since we're ending the play if that exists. But I left it here just to show as an example. You can specify that a task doesn't run if this service exists. So if there were other tasks in here that we didn't want to completely end the play, if the SQL Server has already been installed, then we can continue on, but only exclude specific tasks if that service info exists. So just as an example in here, feel free to delete these, but thought you might find that useful. The next step is we're going to copy the ISO to the target. So I have an ISO, I have the SQL Server 2022 Developer Edition ISO in this directory in my Ubuntu, uh, essentially a Ubuntu virtual machine. It's in the home Luke ISO SQL 2022 directory. And you can see that here. If I just expand that, it's here. So we're going to copy it from that machine over to ctemp, which is the folder that we created in the previous task. Next, we're going to copy the configuration.ini file to target. So this is where we're using our Jinja 2 template. Right now, there's not a lot of templatizing that I've done. I've kept the ini file pretty simple, but in later episodes, we'll really dive into Jinja and see how powerful uh, it is whenever we want to set up different, not just the default instance, but named instances, and also if we want to change some settings around using that ini file. So we're going to use the built-in template. The source is our Jinja 2 file, the config 2022, and the destination is going to be ctemp configuration.ini because we're going to use that when we call setup.exe to install SQL Server. Let's go ahead and look at that config 2022 Jinja 2 file. And you can see it's pretty vanilla configuration file that you'd find with a typical SQL Server setup. So I don't have anything templatized in here just yet, but kept it simple for this one. The action is install. English version of SQL Server is true. Of course, we accept the licenses. And then if we scroll down a bit, I'm not going to go through each one of these, but this file is available in the GitHub repo. Instance name is MS SQL Server. So this is an example of something that we would templatize if we wanted to install named instances. The instance directory, this is something else that we would templatize. Automatic, we may not want the agent to start automatically. Most times you do, but that's something. Each one of these values can be templatized. And then if we go ahead and scroll down, I'm just setting max stop to 4. That's something else that we could templatize. And security mode is SQL, so it's mixed mode authentication. You'll see in a second in the playbook where we pass in the SA password. TempDB, file size, file count, all of these values are things that are potentially should be templatized later on, especially the directories and the file sizes and everything. So we're going to be installing to the E drive. Right now we're just using the default, the SQL backup directory. We're going to set that to T SQL backup. Normally you would place your backups on a file share separate of this server, but of course this is just a simple demo. Our user DB directory will be E data F log for our log directory. And then max memory, we're just leaving that as defaults for now. So that's just a real quick look of this J2 file. We're going to jump back into our playbook. After we've copied our configuration.ini file, we're then going to mount the ISO, and we call Ansible's WinDiskImage module to do that. And then the image path is ctemp, and then the ISO name, state is present. We're going to register a disk image out, and then if that changes, that handler that we defined at the top is going to run and wait 5 seconds before it continues on to the next task. The next one is just a debug task so that we can see what drive letter was assigned to that ISO when it was mounted. You can remove that. I left it in here just as an example of using the debug module. The next thing, we're going to actually use Ansible setFact module, and we're going to define our SQL Server SA password. So SA password switch, and then we're going to pass this value in from the command line when we run the playbook. So that this is, if you think later on, sometimes you may be installing SQL Server in a Windows authentication only mode, and you wouldn't be passing in the SA password. So we want to templatize that and parameterize it so it only gets passed in whenever we are installing in SQL or mixed mode. So we'll build on that a little bit later. I just left that in here as an example. Next, we are actually going to install the default instance using the win command module. And this is our command. This is disk image out. So that's basically saying the G drive, this is the mount path for our ISO. We're going to run setup.exe, pass in the configuration file that we copied over, and then this is our SA password that we're going to be placing. Next, after the installation, we're going to do a little bit of cleanup. We're going to unmount the ISO. Ensure we're going to call WinDiskImage again, the image path, and then we're going to make sure that the state is absent, and then we're going to delete that temp directory. So a lot to cover there, and we'll build on this as we go through the series. But let's go ahead and jump into WSL, our terminal window. I have already changed the directory to where this playbook resides. And let's go ahead and we're going to use Ansible Playbook just like we did in episode 1. The -I passes in the inventory file, which is host.ini. We're going to be using the playbook install SQL Server.yml. That's our playbook. The user is my domain account, luke@homelab.local. We're going to be prompted for my password, and then the extra vars is where we're passing in our SA password. Now, there's other ways you can do this. You can use Ansible Vault and store your passwords in another file and then encrypt that file. but we'll cover Ansible Vault in a later episode. So let's go ahead and start this. And let's see, what did I do here? Wrong password. All right, so here we go. Again, gathering facts. That's something that Ansible's going to do by default. And then you'll see that it's going and importing our previous playbook, which was diskprep.yml, and it's going to go ahead and set up our disks for us. We should see those pop in here. This is back on SRV1. And we can see the T drive, E drive, and there's our F drive. And then as those are getting formatted, we'll see that the space becomes available. All right, so now it's finished with that playbook. It formatted all the disks. Now it's going to run the install SQL Server play. Here we're determining if the default instance exists. It doesn't exist, so we skipped past the in play task. So it doesn't matter. We can run this playbook again, and we will at the end, and just to show that Ansible won't make any changes because that service is already in place. We'll go ahead and jump over to SRV1. I'll just show you that temp file or temp folder. The ISO is not there yet, but it will be in just a second. Let's go ahead and take a look at the power plan and see if it changed. And it did, so we're already on high performance. So it copied the ISO over. Let's go look and make sure. Yep, there's the ISO. There's our configuration.ini file. So it basically renamed that config 2022.j2 file to configuration.ini file. Now we can see that the ISO was just mounted. We can see it here. Jump back to our play. And this is our debug task so that we know that the ISO was mounted on the G drive. That's just in case you needed to see some other properties of that of those mount disk image out properties. And now it's working on the installation of default instance. Previously, this has taken about 6 minutes to install on 2 servers. So I'll speed this video up a bit so that we're not sitting here staring at this blinking cursor. All right, we can see that it finished, installed default instance, unmounted the ISO, and cleaned up the temp directory. Let's jump over to SRV1 and take a look. We'll look at our directories so we can see the E has our data directory, and it should also have our system databases. It does. And then F doesn't have anything there yet because we don't have any user databases. And then we've got our SQL backup folder, which won't be used. And then we have SQL data that has our tempdb. And if we take a look at, we now have a SQL Server 2022 folder, and we can look at the configuration manager and see that SQL Server and the SQL Server agent are both installed and running, set to automatic, and then we just use the NT service service accounts. Same on SRV2. And let's go make sure that Ansible cleaned up after itself. And the temp folder, we still have this one, this is for something else, but the temp folder that was created was deleted. So that, in a nutshell, is how you do a simple install of SQL Server using Ansible. Now, there's a lot more that you can do uh, as we get into this series, such as setting the firewall ports for SQL Server, and also setting which port the SQL Server is going to run on, building databases that you may have your management tools inside. Instead of putting those in master, you may have put all your scripts inside of another management database, setting up standard jobs using the for SQL Server agent. A lot of different things that you can do with Ansible, but we'll get into those that series. We'll get into those as we continue this series. Next up, we'll probably be diving into the Jinja 2 templates a bit more. Something that you're interested in, be sure to subscribe and check out the blog post or newsletter over at dbachallenges.com. And again, thanks again for watching.